Christmas dinner smelled like prime rib and nutmeg when my mother raised her glass for a toast, smiled for the cousins, and with the tip of her fork nudged the little velvet ring box by my glass so it slid toward the gravy boat. Then, like the weather, she said, "You're the most useless child we have." The room glittered, carols played, and I watched the line the box carved in the linen. Proof I was there and somehow wasn't. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Quinn, and the night I stopped being my family's safety net began the way every holiday on Cedar Lane begins, with the porch light throwing a soft halo on the snowbank and my dad's shadow moving across the glass before he opened the door. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like cedar chips and dish soap and said I was right on time, even though I could see through the dining room arch that the place cards were already set. My mother's blue script curled across little tents at each plate like a flourish from a piano lesson. And when I slid my coat from my shoulders and tucked the velvet ring box into my palm, I glanced toward the end and realized there wasn't one for me. My mother appeared with a smile that didn't touch her eyes and said, "Just squeeze in there, Ray," and nodded at a folding chair nudged in at the corner where coats had already started to slump in a pile. The smell of prime rib and rosemary drifted down the hall, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer chimed, and I pressed my thumb against the velvet hinge and told myself I would know when the moment arrived. Andrew was already planted near the tree with a bottle of Cabernet tilted just enough to show the label, his cufflinks clicking against the glass whenever he gestured. He knows how to set up a story, so the laugh arrives right when he raises his eyebrows, and the cousins gathered like fish in a bright current. Brooke looked like a lifestyle ad in winter white, and a gold chain that caught the string lights, her hair smooth as a ribbon, her phone face down on the sideboard like she wanted me to notice that she could do that. My mother, Diane, moved in an orbit that tugged the room around her, straightening a runner that didn't need straightening, touching Brooke's shoulder lightly, adjusting the angle of a candle, then pausing at me to look at my dress and say green was a difficult color. Blue photographs better. My dad took the gift bag from my hand with a wink and whispered, "The roast had the best crust he'd ever managed," then glanced at the folding chair and sent me an apology with his eyebrows that said, "We'll make this work like we always do." The velvet box sat beside my water glass and looked small enough to forget and big enough to cast its own light. I put the envelope with my new contract deeper into my coat pocket, paper warm from my palm, and decided to look anywhere else. At the cut glass bowls that only come out in December. At the poinsettia that always shows up on that sideboard like it pays rent. At the framed photograph of my grandparents in double-breasted coats during their first winter in the house, cheeks blown bright by cold. I had found the negative in a paper envelope under a stack of receipts and coaxed the image back with careful hours at my kitchen table. The ghost of snow on the porch rail slowly sharpening into white. Evan was across the country with his parents in Philadelphia, and an overnight shift on the ambulance to bookend the day, because emergencies do not check their calendars. But he had said to say the words when they felt like mine to say, and I trusted that. The neighbor's daughter, home from college and working the catering tray to help her mom, paused when she saw the little velvet square. She leaned in with a conspirator's grin and whispered congratulations, and for a heartbeat, the air tilted toward me, warm and golden and new. Then my mother lifted her glass and called the room to attention to toast Andrew's bonus and Brooke's new clinic lease and the way this family keeps climbing. And the moment closed like a door pushed against a gust of wind. I smiled at the neighbor's daughter and took a bacon-wrapped date and tucked her kindness into the pocket of my brain like a match cupped against a draft, then followed Dad into the dining room and slipped onto the folding chair. The legs hummed against the wood every time someone bumped the table, a soft metallic buzz underneath the clink of plates and the twang of an old carol from the speaker. Prime rib landed with a proud weight, and the room found its rhythm stories spun, Interruptions practiced, the polite dance of reaching and passing, when the music slipped into a song my mother always prefers. When the gravy boat had finished steaming and Dad's hand found my shoulder in a way that said, "I'm paying attention." I let the sentence stand up in my throat. "We're engaged," I said, placing my fingers over the velvet box to steady it. And the first seconds were as good as I had imagined. Grandma's soft yes landing on my palm. Cousins leaning with open faces. Dad's eyes wet and quick to clear. Brooke said, "Oh," in a bright bubble, and Andrew clapped me on the back with a surprisingly genuine smile. And then my mother's fork made a quiet click against her plate as she nudged the box away from her napkin like it was clutter. She asked if Evan ever thought about finding a schedule that made sense for a real life, and Andrew joked that cities always need ambulances. And the ring sat there winking to itself as if the tablecloth were ashore. I had more news. And I waited for coffee and pie and the loose stretch of conversation that opens after plates are moved and people lean back. I told them my company had asked me to lead a neighborhood energy project in Seattle, that it would start in the spring, that I was excited and scared in equal measure, and that felt right. Grandma's smile widened in that quiet way of hers that says, "This is what we hoped for you, even if we did not know what to call it." My dad said he'd always wanted to see those trees that touched the sky. And my mother tilted her mouth into a line and said that was a long way to go for a trend, and Seattle was very rainy, as if rain were an argument against a plan. I slid the framed photograph of her parents across the linen as dessert arrived, watched her recognize her own face in her mother's and soften, and then watched her turn to my cousin Lila and say it would be perfect on her wall. And the photograph changed hands like a coin toss to decide something quickly. My mother put her fork down on the plate with that tap she uses to bring the room into focus. She smiled at me as if we were two people who like each other. And she said she had been thinking. She said people should be realistic, and feelings are sweet, but they do not pay the mortgage. And then she set the sentence in the center of my plate like a place card. "You're the most useless child we have, Rachel," she said, light as weather. "I hope you understand what you're asking that man to sign up for." The silence that followed did not break anything. It covered everything, soft and complete. Dad pulled his hand away from his coffee mug like it had suddenly turned hot. Grandma's fork hovered, stopped, and hung in the air. Andrew's jaw moved once without a sentence attached. And Brooke's hands went flat on the table like she needed the contact to steady herself. What rose in me wasn't a shout and it wasn't a speech. It was a clear pane of glass where there had been fog. I stood without scraping my chair and reached for the remote on the sideboard and pressed a button that made the television become a mirror. My phone's screen blinked into the room. A list plain as a grocery receipt. Dates stacked like fence posts. The county property tax I'd been covering every December, so a deadline was never missed. The pharmacy plan and equipment supplier that brought Dad's machine filters and medication to their door mid-month. The landlord's deposit that helped Brooke sign the clinic lease when her accounts were stretched by optimism. The transfer in spring to help Andrew over a bonus delay when the card at a client dinner had run too close to the line. No fireworks, no confessionals, just numbers and time, and a person who believed usefulness might be a route toward love. I said I had set those up 2 years ago when the car died the same week the water heater wheezed its last, and Dad's hours were slashed. And that, I kept it quiet because it seemed kinder and because my mother had asked. And because there's a kind of peace you can buy with a clean transaction and a secret. Dad slid his chair back an inch, wood on wood, and turned toward my mother with a face that did not belong to the man who lets things blow over. It belonged to the man who fixes the hinge before it breaks. Andrew glanced at him, and then at me, and then at our mother, as if she had a way to narrate this out of existence. Brooke stared at the television where her practice's name sat next to a number that used to live only in my bank account, and she did not move her hands. I had a change queued and ready, because the truth is we practice our courage in small rehearsals we pretend are imagination. I told them that, as of now, those payments would stop. All of them. that the county would collect from the person who owned the house and the pharmacy would call the person who used the machine, and the clinic would be responsible to itself. I said I was going to use my money to pay for walls that held my sleep and meals that fed my days and flights that got me where I chose to go because I have work to do that doesn't include performing usefulness like a ticket at a turnstile. I pressed my thumb to the screen. On the television, the list erased itself line by line, leaving a blank white field of winter. A moment later, my phone hummed with an automated confirmation call from the bank, a careful voice asking me to verify the changes. And I said yes out loud, and the room heard the click that makes a decision become a fact. Dad asked my mother how long this had been going on without him, and Grandma said enough with the quiet authority of someone who has held families together with twine and prayer and memory. Andrew started to say families help families. And then the spring date and the number next to his name met his eyes, and he let the sentence stop before it tied itself into a knot he couldn't get out of. Brooke smoothed her napkin with her fingertips like she could calm the linen, even if she couldn't find a way to arrange her face. I took the spare key with the red cap from my wallet, the one that opens the back door when your hands are full of groceries and you don't want to track in snow, and I set it on the table. It slid across the linen and left a neat path through a dusting of salt someone had spilled with the candied pecans. I placed a small cream card beside it with our wedding plan in Honest Black Type Courthouse in March at noon. Lunch after. Attendance by invitation to those who can be kind. I lifted my coat from the top of the stack with the muscle memory of a person who has always been the last to leave and the first to clean. At the doorway, I pulled up the family message thread we use to pass casseroles and obligations and jokes that have been told too many times. And I scrolled to the bottom and tapped the option that lets a person step out. The screen asked if I was sure, and I told it I was. And the little row of faces cooled to gray. I did not look back into the dining room because I had already taken what I was keeping, and it did not require my eyes. Outside, the snow made that thin crust sound that lives on the edge of freezing, and my car door protested the cold when I opened it, and the porch windows shifted their light as the people inside the house moved their bodies and carried their words to other rooms. The walk to the car felt shorter than the walk up the steps had felt an hour earlier, and that is something to remember about these things. In the car, I did not cry right away. I watched my hands on the steering wheel and noticed that they were steady. Then, my phone buzzed with Evan's name, and his voice filled the car in that way a warm song does when you've just turned the radio on after driving in silence. I told him the short version because the long version was still vibrating in my bones. And he said, "I'm here. Sleep if you can. I'll be there in the morning." I closed my eyes in the driveway of my building and slept with my coat still on. And when I woke up, the lights in the hallway had clicked themselves off, and the night had moved closer. Morning brought calls and messages that stacked the lock screen like a deck of cards, and I turned the phone face down and made coffee and stood at the sink while the sun lifted itself over the brick building across the alley. Evan let himself in after his shift and sat on the rug with his back against the couch and listened without interrupting, his radio quiet on the floor beside him. Somewhere between the part where I mirrored my phone to the television and the part where I left the family thread, he reached for my ankle and held it with 2 fingers the way you hold a pen you love, and the warmth that moved up my leg felt like a fuse burning towards something useful. He did not tell me what I should do next. He told me I had done enough for one night, and now we would eat and sit and breathe. And then he fell asleep with his head tipped into my knee and his breath slow and regular. It was my father who sent a card 2 days later instead of calling again. The front had a lighthouse in a watercolor that looked like someone's first attempt at a seascape. And inside, his careful letters said he was sorry he hadn't seen, and sorry he hadn't asked, and proud of me for doing a hard thing in a kind way. The word proud made my eyes sting because he doesn't use it lightly. Grandma mailed a small brown package that rattled when I shook it, And inside was the pearl hair clip she had worn in the first week she lived in that house, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly like her dresser drawers. Her note was 2 lines long and said only that she loved me and that some truth-telling doesn't need volume to carry. I put the clip in the bowl by my keys where I keep the everyday valuable things. And it looked right there, useful and beautiful and not locked away. Brooke called with a voice tuned to the key of brightness that can shatter if you lean on it. And she said families help families, and I said yes. And I did. And now she could help someone by choosing kindness in a conversation that did not include money. She asked what color we were painting our kitchen, as if a subject with no edges could save us. And I told her the blue we'd chosen wasn't the one that photographs better. And we laughed a little because sometimes laughing at the wrong thing keeps you from crying at the right one. Andrew sent a clean apology with none of the flourishes his work demands and said he would make good on what he owed. And I told him I wasn't keeping a ledger. And if he wanted to be my brother, he should start by asking me a question about my life and listening to the answer. My mother's messages arrived like weather fronts, quick and sharp, then soft, then long and practical without the admissions that make practical useful. And I did not respond. There are choices that only work if you refuse to undo them in the first week. I took the spare key to Cedar Lane, slid it into an envelope with a blank sheet of white paper, and walked to the post office. The clerk on duty had the kind of face that tells you he has seen a lot of family business make its way across his counter, and he treats all of it the same. He taped the edge with a practiced hand and slid it back under the glass, and I addressed it in the neatest print I could manage. And when I pushed it into the brass mouth, it sounded like a small door closing that no one else would hear. Packing for Seattle took over the living room, and I learned to box a lamp without breaking the light bulb and how to carry a stack of books without pulling a shoulder. I left the apartment on a Wednesday and locked the door and handed the keys to the manager and said thank you for the quiet this place had given me when I needed it. Seattle met me with a wet wind and a low sky, and a trailer that smelled like plywood and coffee and new plans. The site sat on the edge of a neighborhood where people noticed the way bills changed when the weather changed, and I learned the names of the crew and where they keep the spare gloves and which pastry the foreman pretends not to like. Panels lean toward whatever light there was, and the device that turns that light into useful current hums steady, like a sleeping heart. And I learned to measure time by what got wired and what stood under weather, and what would keep working in a storm. At night, I unrolled a rug and tucked a plant into the corner, and learned which window held morning and which corner kept dusk. And when I lay still in bed, the quiet sounded like permission. We were married at the courthouse in March, with 2 friends, and my grandmother in her good coat, and my father in a suit that smelled like cedar and an old careful habit of doing things right. The judge read from a page and then looked at us the way people look when they still mean what their job asks them to say. And Evan's hands were steady as he slid the ring on. And I laughed when my throat got tight, because sometimes the best way to hold a feeling is to let it spill a little. We ate soup and bread at a cafe with a window that watched the ferry move like a lesson in patience. And when Evan wiped a line of soup from the corner of my mouth with his thumb, I thought about how one simple choice at the right time closes 100 doors you no longer need to test. Later, I put the pearl clip in my hair and took a photograph with Grandma in the courthouse lobby, and she told me I looked like someone who had found the right house in the right weather. We rented a small Craftsman with a porch that leaned toward the street like it was listening. And the first week, I strung lights along the fence even though the rain would test them, and discovered that they held. Evan hung a hook by the back door for his radio, and the sound of it in the night no longer made my heart race because it wasn't a summons I could answer. And that was the difference between noise and alarm. Sundays became a ritual I recognized as mine. A farmer's market with bread that crumbled in the car, a plant we didn't need, a conversation about when to plant herbs that lasted 3 blocks and then 2 days without us noticing. The days began to feel like they belonged to us all the way to their edges. And I learned how much space comes back to you when you stop spending it on bracing. Easter arrived, and I didn't drive to Cleveland because promises do not keep if you water them with exceptions. A postcard from Mrs. Kaplan arrived with a watercolor tulip on the front, and her neat hand said the coat drive missed me, and the sorting took longer without my labels. And I smiled, because sometimes the most generous gift is noticing a small absence. A week later, Dad slid an envelope under my door with a photograph of the Cedar Lane dining room in spring light, where the folding chair sat empty and oddly loud. And on the back he'd written, "We miss you," in a hand that didn't demand anything, and therefore meant everything. I put the picture between two dish towels in the drawer, as if softness could protect a truth that still needed time. Work changed in the way work does when your attention returns to your own life and stops freelancing for someone else's. My team noticed I didn't jump at shadows, and my boss noticed I volunteered for the difficult middle and still left meetings without wearing the exhaustion like a badge. And a man in a meeting said my name with the kind of respect that closes a circle you didn't know was open. Evan came home after a long night and fell asleep with his head on my stomach and his radio quiet. And the only sound in the room besides his breathing was the steady hum from the corner where the power box did its work. And it felt like a house at peace, not a house waiting. On a gray Wednesday, the sky changed its mind every 10 minutes, and I stood on the porch and watched rain march down the block like a curtain someone was pulling. And I thought about how endings make a lot of noise on the way in and are very quiet when they arrive. In June, a package without a return address appeared with a photograph of my mother and me on a summer day when we were both so young our laughter bent our bodies into curves. And I set it on the kitchen counter and let it be what it was. I did not call her and I did not throw it away. I moved it to the end of the counter near the bowl where I keep my keys, and for a month it lived there like a small weather system that didn't need to change the temperature to be real. By late summer, the couch had a dent exactly where two people sit after days that ask for that kind of sitting. And a painter had left a faint handprint on the back bedroom wall we didn't scrub away, because a mark like that can be the kind of blessing some houses need. I tucked a new business card into my wallet, not because I had anything to prove, but because I liked the tooth of the paper. And sometimes liking a thing is reason enough. If there's a lesson, I can hand anyone. It fits in the path a spare key leaves when you slide it across a table. It wasn't a speech or a verdict. It was a series of small refusals, lined up in the right order, and then defended by silence. I did not go back. I did not apologize. I did not explain. I kept the photograph my grandmother loved, and the clip she sent, and the letter my father wrote in careful lines. And I let the rest settle into the place it was always going to find without me holding it up. Somewhere on Cedar Lane, the brittle still needs to be poured at exactly the right second, and the wood still shines under candlelight, and the empty chair at the edge of the table is still empty. And maybe once in a while someone notices the space it leaves and the time it gives back. On our porch in the blue hour, the wind lifts the edges of the welcome mat, and the lights along the fence come on one by one like a soft applause. And the hum from the corner where current becomes comfort keeps time under everything. No emergency thread buzzes the table, and no midnight demand pulls me out of myself. And the quiet doesn't feel like the moment before a blow. It feels like the calm of a life you've chosen on purpose, a house that hums at a pitch you can live inside. I hope that chair back on Cedar Lane keeps doing its work without me, reminding a room that a person can be useful in ways that do not show up in a toast, and that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do for a family is to stop making the impossible look easy.